Chapter 2 of Deleuze and Guattari's Kafka toward a minor literature titled An Exaggerated Oedipus is a rich and complex exploration of Kafka's relationship to psychoanalysis, the Oedipus complex, and the nature of desire itself. The chapter is a key moment in Deleuze and Guattari's larger project of developing a new mode of literary and philosophical analysis, one that is able to break free from the constraints of representation, identity, and meaning, and open up new possibilities for creativity, resistance, and transformation. At the heart of the chapter is a close reading of Kafka's famous Letter to His Father, a text that has often been seen as a key to understanding Kafka's life and work. In the dominant psychoanalytic interpretation, the letter is read as a confession of Kafka's Oedipal guilt, his tortured relationship with his father, and his own neurotic hang-ups and inhibitions. But for Deleuze and Guattari, this reading misses the point entirely. Far from being a straightforward expression of Oedipal conflict, they argue the letter is a carefully constructed literary machine that deliberately exaggerates and distorts the figure of the father to the point of absurdity. Through a detailed and nuanced analysis of the letter's rhetorical strategies and literary techniques, Deleuze and Guattari show how Kafka systematically undermines and subverts the authority of the father figure. They point to passages where Kafka describes his father as a giant insect, a monstrous vermin, and a huge man with protuberant eyes and unclean habits. Kafka, Letter to His Father, cited in Deleuze and Guattari 10. These grotesque and exaggerated descriptions, they argue, are not simply expressions of Kafka's own fear or disgust, but deliberate attempts to push the logic of the Oedipal relationship to its absurd extreme. By inflating the figure of the father to such monstrous proportions, Kafka is able to reveal the essential arbitrariness and emptiness of the Oedipal law itself. He shows how the father's authority is not based on any inherent or natural superiority, but on a kind of mythical and fantastical projection that can be punctured and deflated through the power of language and imagination. At the same time, Kafka implicates himself in this dynamic, presenting himself as a masochistic and submissive son who derives a perverse enjoyment from his own humiliation and abjection. But as Deleuze and Guattari are quick to point out, this masochism is not a sign of Kafka's own neurosis or pathology, but a deliberate literary strategy that allows him to break free from the Oedipal trap. By pushing the logic of guilt, submission, and self-abasement to its absurd extreme, Kafka is able to reveal its essential hollowness and open up a space for a different kind of desire and subjectivity to emerge. This is what Deleuze and Guattari mean by deterritorialization, the process by which established codes, structures, and identities are broken down and reconfigured in new and unexpected ways. Throughout the chapter, Deleuze and Guattari trace this movement of deterritorialization across Kafka's oeuvre, showing how it takes on different forms and guises in his novels, stories, and fragments. One of the key concepts they develop in this context is that of becoming animal. For Deleuze and Guattari, Kafka's famous animal stories, The Metamorphosis, A Report to an Academy, Investigations of a Dog, and others, are not simply allegories or symbols of human alienation and despair, but literal embodiments of the deterritorializing power of desire. When Gregor Samsa wakes up one morning to find himself transformed into a giant insect, or when Red Peter the ape delivers his report to the Academy on his former life as an ape. These are not just metaphors for the human condition, but real processes of becoming that break down the boundaries between the human and the animal, the civilized and the savage, the rational and the instinctual. As Deleuze and Guattari put it, to become animal is to participate in movement, to stake out the path of escape in all its positivity, to cross a threshold, to reach a continuum of intensities that are valuable only in themselves, to find a world of pure intensities where all forms come undone, as do all the significations, signifiers and signifieds, to the benefit of an unformed matter of deterritorialized flux, of non-signifying signs. 13. This idea of becoming animal as a process of deterritorialization and escape has been hugely influential in contemporary philosophy, literature, and cultural theory. It has been taken up by writers and thinkers as diverse as J.M. Coetzee, whose novel The Lives of Animals explores the ethical and political implications of human-animal relations. Donna Haraway, whose concept of companion species challenges the binary opposition between nature and culture, and Giorgio Agamben, whose work on bare life and the anthropological machine draws heavily on Deleuze and Guattari's ideas. But for Deleuze and Guattari, the concept of becoming animal is not just a theoretical abstraction, but a concrete and practical tool for rethinking the nature of subjectivity and desire. They see in Kafka's animal stories a kind of map or diagram of the forces that shape and constrain our desires, a cartography of the Oedipal machine that allows us to see its workings more clearly and thus to begin to imagine ways of resisting or escaping it. This is why they place so much emphasis on the idea of the schizo or diabolical animal in Kafka's work. For them, the schizo animal is the opposite of the neurotic or Oedipal animal, not a symbol of repressed or sublimated desire, but an active and creative force that is able to break free from the constraints of subjectivity and identity. The schizo animal is the one that is able to deterritorialize itself, to escape from the established codes and structures that define it and open up new lines of flight and transformation. We can see this idea of the schizo animal at work in many of Kafka's stories and fragments. In The Burrow, for example, the narrator is a mole-like creature who becomes increasingly paranoid and obsessed with protecting his underground home from imaginary enemies and threats. But as the story progresses, we begin to see how this paranoia is not simply a psychological quirk or a neurotic symptom, but a kind of schizophrenic process that deterritorializes the very idea of home, identity, and security. As the burrow becomes more and more elaborate and labyrinthine, with its endless tunnels, chambers, and dead ends, it becomes clear that it is not just a physical structure, but a kind of mental landscape, a map of the narrator's own desires and fears. And as the narrator becomes more and more lost in this landscape, unable to distinguish between reality and fantasy, inside and outside, self and other, we see how the burrow itself becomes a kind of schizo machine, a device for breaking down the boundaries of subjectivity and opening up new possibilities of experience and perception. This is just one example of how Kafka's animal stories can be read as explorations of the deterritorializing power of desire, as tools for mapping out the contours of the Oedipal machine and imagining ways of escaping or subverting it. And for Deleuze and Guattari, This is the real significance of Kafka's work, not as a reflection of his own neuroses or complexes, but as a machine for the production of new forms of subjectivity and new modes of resistance and transformation. Of course, as they are quick to point out, this process of deterritorialization is never simple or straightforward. Kafka's writing is marked by a constant tension between the desire for escape and the fear of what lies beyond, between the impulse to deterritorialize and the temptation to reterritorialize. We can see this tension at work in stories like The Metamorphoses, where Gregor Samsa's transformation into an insect is both a liberation from the constraints of his bourgeois existence and a new form of imprisonment and alienation, or in novels like The Castle, where Kay's quest for acceptance and belonging is constantly thwarted by the elusive and impenetrable bureaucracy of the castle authorities. But for Deleuze and Guattari, it is precisely this tension, this constant oscillation between deterritorialization and reterritorialization that gives Kafka's work its unique power and significance. By staging this struggle in such vivid and compelling terms, Kafka is able to create a kind of archive or repertoire of the different strategies and techniques of subjectivation, a catalogue of the different ways in which desire can be captured, channeled and controlled, but also of the different lines of flight and escape that are always available to us. In this sense, An Exaggerated Oedipus is not just a chapter about Kafka, but a kind of toolbox or arsenal for the critique and transformation of the subject. It provides us with a set of concepts, ideas and examples that can help us to map out the workings of power and desire in our own lives, to identify the Oedipal traps and neurotic dead ends that keep us locked in cycles of guilt, anxiety, and self-hatred, but also to discover the schizo flows and diabolical escapes that can lead us to new forms of creativity, community, and joy. Ultimately, what Deleuze and Guattari offer us in this chapter is not a doctrine or a program, but an invitation to experiment, to take up Kafka's writing as a kind of machine or assemblage that we can use to produce new effects and experiences in our own lives. They challenge us to read Kafka, not as a tragic figure of alienation and despair, but as a comic hero of desire and transformation, a trickster and a shapeshifter who is always finding new ways to elude the traps of identity and representation. And in doing so, they also challenge us to rethink our own relationship to literature, psychoanalysis, and politics. They show us how the act of reading itself can be a form of deterritorialization, a way of breaking free from the established codices and conventions that govern our understanding of texts, and opening up new possibilities of interpretation and invention. They suggest that the task of literary criticism is not to explain or interpret texts, but to use them as tools for the production of new desires, new subjectivities, and new forms of social and political life. At the same time, they also offer a profound critique of psychoanalysis and its claim to be the master discourse of desire and subjectivity. By showing how Kafka's work constantly subverts and parodies the Oedipal logic of guilt, lack, and castration, they suggest that psychoanalysis itself is a kind of Oedipal machine, a system of capture and control that seeks to reduce the multiplicity and heterogeneity of desire to a set of universal structures and norms. Against this reductive and normalizing tendency, they propose a new kind of schizoanalysis, a mode of inquiry that is able to follow the schizoflows and diabolical escapes of desire wherever they may lead, without imposing any pre-established categories or identities. This is not to suggest that schizoanalysis is a panacea or a magic bullet, but rather that it is a tool or a weapon that can be used to resist the forces of Oedipalization and reterritorialization, to create new possibilities of life and experience that are not governed by the law of the father or the logic of lack. Ultimately, then, an exaggerated Oedipus is a chapter that invites us to join Deleuze and Guattari in their own becoming Kafka, their own attempt to use Kafka's writing as a machine for the production of new forms of thought and existence. It is a chapter that challenges us to read differently, to think differently, and to live differently, to embrace the schizoflows and diabolical escapes that are always available to us, even in the midst of the most oppressive and normalizing social machines. In this sense, it is a chapter that is not just about literature or psychoanalysis, but about the very nature of desire and its relationship to politics, ethics, and creativity. It is a chapter that shows us how the act of reading and writing can be a form of resistance and transformation, a way of creating new possibilities of life and experience that are not governed by the established codes and conventions of society. And in doing so, it also offers us a new vision of what politics and ethics might look like in the age of latte capitalism and global crisis, against the cynicism and despair that often characterize contemporary political discourse. Deleuze and Guattari suggest that the task of politics is not to represent or speak for the oppressed and marginalized, but to create the conditions for their own self-expression and self-determination. They propose a politics of desire and experimentation, a politics that is able to follow the lines of flight and escape that are always available to us, even in the most dire and oppressive circumstances. This is a politics that is not based on identity or representation, but on difference and multiplicity, a politics that is able to affirm the singularity and creativity of each individual and group, while also fostering new forms of solidarity and collective action. It is a politics that is not afraid to challenge the established order and the dominant codes of society, but that is also able to create new forms of life and experience that are not governed by the logic of profit and accumulation. In this sense, an exaggerated Oedipus is not just a chapter in a book about Kafka, but a manifesto for a new kind of politics and a new kind of ethics, a call to arms for all those who refuse to accept the world as it is, and who dare to imagine and create something different. It is a text that invites us to join the ranks of the schizos and the devils, the tricksters and the shapeshifters, all those who are able to follow the lines of flight and escape that are always available to us, even in the darkest and most desperate of times. And in doing so, it also invites us to join the ranks of Kafka himself, that great experimentalist and innovator of modern literature, whose work continues to inspire and challenge us to this day. For as Deleuze and Guattari remind us, Kafka's writing is not a lament or a cry of despair, but a call to action and a tool for transformation, a machine that is always ready to be taken up and used by anyone who is willing to follow its lines of flight and escape. In the end, then, an exaggerated Oedipus is a chapter that leaves us with more questions than answers, more possibilities than certainties, but it is also a chapter that leaves us with a sense of hope and inspiration, a sense that even in the midst of the most oppressive and normalizing social machines, there are always new forms of creativity and resistance waiting to be born. And it is this sense of hope and possibility that makes Deleuze and Guattari's reading of Kafka so vital and necessary today, not just for scholars and students of literature, but for anyone who still believes in the power of the imagination to transform the world.